Everything began with silence. Not the kind that haunts an empty house, but the kind that feels arranged. Heavy, deliberate, almost sacred. Inside a vast glass mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, the morning light spilt through floor-to-ceiling windows, laying golden streaks across the polished marble floor. Each tick of the grandfather clock sounded too loud, as if it didn't belong here, in a home more accustomed to power and applause than to the sound of passing time. 7:42 a.m., Tuesday. Elliot Barnes, CEO of Harmonic Industries, one of the world's largest music corporations, stood silently before a 9-foot Steinway grand piano, staring at it like a relic from another man's life. He hadn't touched those keys in years. Once, music had been his breath, before the private jets, before his face on the cover of Forbes. Elliot had been just a boy practicing Chopin in his grandmother's attic, playing until his fingertips grew warm against the ivory. But that was before the empire, before money made him forget the sound of true silence. Now, his mansion had everything, except music. That morning, it wasn't Chopin that stirred the house awake, but the faint hum of a floor polisher in the next room. Raymond Cole, the early shift janitor, was finishing his rounds. He was 63, his shoulders slightly bent. His uniform was worn but neatly pressed, each step careful, measured. The gait of someone who had once handled things far more fragile than marble floors. Most days, Elliot never noticed him, but today, something about the way Raymond moved, those steady circles, that patient rhythm, and the faint hum in his throat, sounded almost like a song. Elliot turned, curiosity flickering. "What tune are you humming?" Raymond looked up. Their eyes met for the first time. He answered soft but firm. "Chopin, sir. Nocturne in E-flat major." Elliot froze. Chopin. That piece again. The one he'd once promised to play at his wedding, before he stopped believing that music could make people better. He gave a dry, half-mocking laugh. "If you play Chopin that well, I might have to marry you myself." Raymond didn't laugh. When Raymond placed his hands on the keys, Elliot let out a small laugh. The half-skeptical kind of laugh that comes from a man too used to cheap performances. But then, the first sound emerged. Not a clumsy note. Not the playing of an old janitor trying to impress. It was the first touch of a soul the world had long forgotten. The opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, No. 2, rose like a breath revived. Light, yet precise. Trembling, yet proud. As if someone were telling the story of an entire life in a language beyond words. Morning light spilt over his hands, wrinkled, calloused fingers that still glided so gently, as if they remembered every key, every silence. Each phrase of Chopin drifted by, every note awakening a fragment of memory. Rain tapping on a Warsaw attic roof, the dim lamp of a young man practicing for Carnegie Hall, and then the sterile, metallic sound of a hospital, the day his mother died. Elliot stood motionless. In that moment, he wasn't a CEO. He was a 17-year-old boy again, stunned before something too beautiful to bear. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath. The vacuum cleaner in the hallway fell silent. A young assistant passing by stopped mid-step as if hypnotized. The music filled the space, not loudly but completely, like water seeping into the walls and air. Everything grew clearer and purer, and every mask of power fell away within that purity. When the piece ended, Raymond kept his hands on the keys for a long while, as though he didn't want the sound to fade. Elliot said nothing. No one did. There was no need. The room was full of light and silence. but no longer the empty silence of the morning. It was the silence of something truly understood. Raymond rose, straightened his faded uniform, and said softly, "Music, sir, isn't meant to impress. It's meant to remind us we still have a heart." Elliot watched him walk away. For the first time in years, he felt his house had a soul. But he didn't yet know that this morning, which began as a joke, would soon become a media after. 3 weeks later, the Harmonic Towers Hotel in Chicago gleamed like a grand orchestra tuning before a symphony. It was the night of the annual Gala, where the elite gathered, wine flowed like rivers, and every laugh, every camera flash was choreographed to perfection. Elliot stepped out of his limousine with his usual air of confidence. Yet his eyes still carried the image of that morning. The old janitor was bowing before the Steinway under soft sunlight. Inside, amid crystal lights and lavish laughter, Raymond Cole was working as always. He didn't belong to this world, at least, not in the way people thought. His faded blue uniform blended into the sea of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, but his calm composure made it impossible to look away. That evening, the hired band from New York ran into a technical crisis. The event manager rushed toward Elliot, panic in her voice. "Sir, they're stuck at the airport. We have no one to open the show." 500 guests turned their heads at once. The stage lights shone blankly on the Steinway at the center. The air grew tense, like a string pulled too tight before tuning. Then, a quiet but steady voice came from behind Elliot. "If you'll allow me, sir, I can help." Every head turned. It was Raymond. The janitor stood there, still holding his mop, but his eyes glowed with the calm certainty of someone about to tell a story in a language this room had long forgotten. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, small but sharp. A lady whispered, "Oh, dear God, what is he doing?" Elliot froze. In that moment, he remembered his own mocking words. "If you can play Chopin, I'll marry you." That foolish joke now stood before him like a mirror, reflecting the arrogance and blindness he once mistook for power. He nodded slowly. "Go ahead, Raymond." Raymond set his mop aside, walked toward the piano under the bright stage light, and sat down with the solemn grace of a man entering sacred ground. This time, he didn't choose Chopin. He chose a piece with no name, something he had written years ago, when he was young, when music was the only place he could speak his pain. The first notes rose like wind. CEO and janitor, only 2 men, 2 generations, standing in a room filled with music and truth. The next morning, the media exploded. A guest from the Gala had posted the clip online, over 12 million views in just 24 hours. The title read, "The Janitor Who Silenced a CEO with One Song." Comments poured in like a flood. He played with his heart. This is what real music sounds like. We need more Raymonds in this world. Elliot read every line, and the more he read, the clearer it became. This story didn't just make people cry, it woke him up. By Monday morning, he walked into the conference room on the 42nd floor where the board was in full panic over what they called this viral disaster. A PR director said frantically, "Sir, we need to respond immediately. The press is demanding an interview. They're saying you mocked your own employee." Elliot was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "No, I won't issue an apology statement. I'll make a real change." That afternoon, he went down to the hotel's basement, where Raymond was still quietly cleaning as if nothing had happened. Dim light spilt through old tiles, and the older man carefully wiped the dust off a piano in the break room corner. Elliot spoke softly. "Raymond, I watched the recording again. You didn't just play music. You showed me the man I forgot I used to be." Raymond looked up, calm and steady. He simply said, "We all forget, sir. But music, it always remembers." A week later, Elliot held a press conference, not to do damage control, but to announce a genuine transformation within the company. He declared, "Starting today, Harmonic Towers will launch the Hidden Virtuosos Fund, a program to support any employee with artistic talent, no matter who they are or what position they hold." Raymond was invited to become the resident pianist in the hotel's grand lobby. The same Steinway he once polished every morning now bore a small brass plaque, in honor of Raymond Cole, who reminded us what grace sounds like. On the opening night, hundreds gathered. Raymond stepped onto the stage, his hands trembling slightly. Elliot sat in the front row, and for the first time the CEO removed his watch, put away his phone. 2:17 a.m., Dallas, Texas. Rain poured heavily over the quiet mansions of Highland Park. The dim yellow streetlights reflected off the small pond by the gate, scattering trembling ripples of light. Inside, Caldwell Manor stood still in the darkness. The long marble corridors, usually alive with footsteps by day, now echoed only the whistling wind through the cracks of closed doors. In the vast living room, surrounded by old paintings and an ivory grand piano, one person remained awake. Eleanor Reed, 54, the housekeeper. Petite, sun-worn hands, and a back slightly stooped from decades of quiet work. She had just finished cleaning the kitchen after a lavish party for Dallas's elite. On the table, a few half-empty champagne glasses glimmered beside crumpled napkins. Eleanor gathered them gently, her movements so soft it seemed she was afraid of waking a memory. In her ears, the rain blended with the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Each sound is a reminder of a life spent in service, precise, discreet, and mechanical. As she passed the piano, she paused. Her fingertips brushed the cool surface of the keys. A Steinway & Sons, worth over $120,000. The owner, Alexander Caldwell, the famed CEO of Caldwell Holdings, had rarely touched a luxurious ornament. She glanced around. No one. Dim lights, shut windows, only the rain whispering outside. Something within her murmured, "Just 1 minute." She sat down. Her fingers trembled slightly. The first notes rose. Chopin, Nocturne in C-sharp minor. The music unfolded, pure and deep, like a confession whispered to the dark. The once cold room seemed warm, as if the walls had been waiting years to hear this. Each key and silence felt like a wound opening and healing in the same breath. She did not play to impress. She played to remember, to speak with the years that had forgotten her, with dreams she had never dared. 2:31 a.m., Caldwell Manor living room, Dallas. Alexander Caldwell slowly stepped out of the shadows, like a judge entering his courtroom. The room was filled with the soft glow of the floor lamp he had just turned on. Eleanor jolted upright, startled. "I'm so sorry, sir. It's all right," he interrupted, his voice low and composed. "I simply didn't expect to hear Chopin in the middle of the night, played by my housekeeper." A pause. His words carried no insult, yet beneath them lingered both surprise and authority, the tone of a man more accustomed to commanding than listening. Eleanor bowed her head, her fingers tightening around her apron. "Forgive me, sir. I only wanted to try again, to remember who I used to be." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "Used to be?" She hesitated, then spoke softly. "A piano teacher in New Orleans, before Hurricane Katrina took everything." Caldwell gave a slight nod, his gaze shifting toward the piano. Then, quietly, "I paid over $100,000 for this thing, and I've never heard it truly come alive until tonight." He took a step closer, curiosity and control mingling in his eyes. "Tell me, Mrs. Eleanor, if I asked you to play again, would you dare?" Eleanor froze. The question sounded less like an invitation than a challenge, but instead of fear she drew a steady breath and sat down. Her fingers touched the keys. This time, not Chopin's Nocturne, but Prelude in E minor, the piece Chopin wrote when his heart was breaking. The notes rose heavy, weighted with memory and loss. Alexander stood silent, his reflection in the polished piano lid revealing what his words never did. A man of vast fortune, yet profoundly alone. A home full of treasures, but empty of human sound. When the final chord faded, he exhaled softly. "Strange. You just made me feel small." Eleanor smiled, the first time she dared to meet his eyes. "Music does that to people, sir. It strips away everything. Leaves an entire room of shareholders." The door closed behind him. Only the rain remained, and the heartbeat of a 54-year-old woman standing in the marble hall, beside a piano, holding a promise no one knew would change an empire. 11:58 a.m. Main conference room, Caldwell Holdings Tower, Dallas. The air inside was so luxurious it felt suffocating. Across the long walnut table lay stacks of reports, charts, and the impassive faces of the company's finance, strategy, and investment directors. White overhead light poured down mercilessly, revealing every flaw, every ink stain, every bead of sweat, every trembling hand. And amid the black suits, Rolex watches, and carefully rehearsed smiles, Eleanor Reed stood in a modest beige dress, wearing low-heeled shoes, beside the grand piano that had been moved that morning. "Is she the cleaning lady?" one man whispered, his tone edged with doubt. "Caldwell must be joking," another muttered, smirking with open disdain. At the head of the table sat Alexander Caldwell, hands clasped, face unreadable. He raised a hand. Silence fell. "Today," he said evenly, "we're going to try something different. Something money can't buy." The murmurs ceased. Eleanor bowed slightly, then took her seat at the piano. Her hands trembled for an instant, and the first note sounded. The entire room stopped breathing. Chopin, Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece began tenderly, then surged like a storm. Each note rose like a question directed at the people who lived by profit margins. "Do you still remember what it means to feel?" The marketing director set down his phone. An elderly investor closed his eyes. The light glinted across the polished table, catching faces trained to calculate, now suddenly disarmed by something raw and human. Caldwell watched Eleanor. He didn't smile, but the steel in his gaze began to soften. Every keystroke mirrored himself. A man who once believed he could control everything. except emotion. Then came the final passage, fierce, luminous, like a storm finding its exit. And when the last chord faded, the room went utterly still. No one spoke, no coughs, no chair scraping, only silence. The kind Eleanor once described as
South Dallas. Eleanor sat beside an old upright piano, guiding an 8-year-old boy's fingers over the keys. At the doorway, Caldwell stood quietly, watching and smiling. Music filled the air again, not inside a mansion or a boardroom, but within real life itself. Those notes no longer just changed a CEO. They were rewriting how he saw the world. If you believe that sometimes a single melody or ordinary soul can make the mighty fall silent, leave a comment below. What do you think? In today's restless world, does music still have the power to reach the human heart? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story, because maybe you could be the one to awaken someone's heart with nothing but a song.